Welcome to Detective Reddington's office. Take a seat and listen to this story. It will be interesting. I never thought my life could turn upside down like this. Jennifer and I had been together for over 12 years, with 2 kids and what seemed like the perfect life. She was always by my side, my reliable partner in everything. Our kids, our home, it was all built from our joint efforts. But after my diagnosis, everything began to change. And it wasn't just my health. I always considered myself strong. I worked day and night to support us. Even after my illness, I kept working, despite the doctors telling me to slow down. Jennifer said she understood. She said she would support me. But over time, something shifted. She started spending more time away from home. At first, it was just work meetings that ran late. Then she began saying she needed to stay overnight at the office because of all the projects. And every time she came home, I could smell alcohol on her. Alcohol, cigarettes, things I'd never smelled on her before. At first, I tried to rationalize it. We all have stress at work, and I figured maybe she was just looking for a way to relax. But something started gnawing at me. One night, when I walked into the living room, she quickly hid her phone. That was strange. Jennifer never used to be secretive. Her phone used to be left lying around, unlocked, anywhere in the house. Now, every time I was near, her phone was locked, and whenever it buzzed with a new message, she immediately closed it without letting me see. This started eating at me. Something was wrong. I knew it, but I didn't want to believe it. Maybe I was just overreacting because of my illness? I hesitated to say anything, but my doubts were growing. I decided to watch her behavior for a few more days. Every night, Jennifer came home with another story about work. Lots of work. Another project. We have to meet the deadline. Normally, I'd believe her, but now everything sounded off. She no longer talked about her life at work like she used to. No stories about colleagues, no plans for the future. Just dry excuses and distant interactions. One evening, she came home late again. She smelled of alcohol, but this time, something was different. She didn't seem as exhausted as usual after a long day at the office. Her mood was strangely upbeat. I asked, "How's work?" She just nodded, saying everything was fine, and quickly headed to the bathroom. That was the last straw for me. The next morning, I decided to confront her. When she came home, I tried to stay calm, but inside, I was boiling. "We need to talk," I began, but she quickly brushed me off. "Not now, Michael. I'm tired." And again, she went to the bedroom, phone in hand, as always. No, this time I couldn't let it go. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to follow her. She always said she left for work at 8 a.m. I watched from the window as she got into her car like always. But this time, she turned in the opposite direction, not toward her office. That growing sense of dread hit me hard. Where was she going this early? I didn't confront her yet. I needed to be sure first. That day, I couldn't focus on work. My thoughts kept going back to where she was. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe she was just working on something important. But deep inside, I knew something was off. My intuition had never failed me before, and I wasn't going to ignore it now. I needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual to follow Jennifer. She was supposed to leave the house at 8 a.m. as usual, like she was going to the office. I stood by the window watching as she started the car. But instead of heading toward her office, she took a different turn. That's when the fear hit me. Was she really hiding something from me? Was I that blind to what was happening? I realized I had to act. I couldn't just sit around waiting for things to escalate. But how? How do you uncover the truth when you can't even figure out what's really going on in your own home? After a few hours of overthinking, I decided to talk to someone who could help. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed to be sure. So I called my old friend, John. He'd been a private detective for years, though he'd left the force and started working for private clients like me. If anyone could help, it was him. We met at a cafe on the edge of town. I told him everything. My suspicions, how Jennifer had been hiding her phone, the bar I'd seen her at, and the turn she took that morning. John listened quietly, nodding occasionally. He didn't ask too many questions. I guess he'd heard this kind of story 100 times before in his line of work. "Michael," he said when I finished, "are you ready for the truth? You need to understand that it might hurt more than you expect." I didn't respond immediately. To be honest, I wasn't ready. But I had to act, even if the truth would destroy me. John promised to start following her the next day. He was a professional, and I knew I could trust him to get the facts. But could I handle the truth? Part 3. Facing the truth. A week had passed since John started following Jennifer. He worked fast, gathering information, but I wasn't in a hurry to find out the results. Part of me was terrified of what I might learn. Every evening when she came home, I watched her, trying to spot any signs, anything that could give me a reason not to suspect the worst. But every time she smiled and told me how her day had gone, all I felt was bitterness. During that week, I began questioning my own sanity. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe my illness was amplifying my fears and making me see things that weren't there. Jennifer had always been trustworthy, and I wanted to believe she still was. But with each excuse, each late night at work, my suspicions grew. Then, one evening, I got a message from John. "Are you ready? I've got something to show you." We arranged to meet the next morning at the same cafe where we had spoken before. I arrived early, unable to wait. My thoughts were all over the place. Part of me still hoped I had been wrong. The other part was bracing for the worst. John walked in carrying a folder. He sat across from me and placed it on the table. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. "This is tough, Michael," John began. "But you need to know." I took the folder and began flipping through the photos. Each one hit me like a punch to the gut. Jennifer was there, sitting with the same man I had seen at the bar. But they weren't just having coffee or drinks. They were far too close. Their embraces, their laughter, that smile I hadn't seen on her face in years. And then, the worst, pictures of them entering a hotel together. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. My head spun, and dark spots clouded my vision. All my fears and suspicions had turned into reality. She had betrayed me. John sat silently beside me, knowing I needed to process this on my own. I stared at those awful pictures, again and again, my heart breaking with every glance. And now what? What was I supposed to do? Divorce had never crossed my mind, not even in the worst-case scenario. But now the thought hit me like a hammer. "I can get you more if you need it," John offered. "There's video from the hotel surveillance, and I can dig deeper." "No," I croaked, though it sounded more like a whisper. "This is enough. You've done more than enough." John nodded and left me alone with my thoughts. I stayed in that cafe for a long time, staring at the pictures of my wife in the arms of another man, realizing that everything I had built for years had crumbled to dust. Sitting at that cafe table, I realized I would never look at Jennifer the same way again. She had betrayed me, and not just betrayed me. She had destroyed everything we had built together. Every moment, every excuse now seemed like part of her grand deception. I had to figure out what to do. The despair inside me turned to anger, then to a cold resolve. I couldn't let her keep playing me for a fool. Driving home, I thought about the kids. What would happen to them? How would they cope with this? But even that couldn't stop me. I couldn't let Jennifer ruin my life and walk away unscathed. She had chosen her path, and now she would pay for it. That night, when she came home late again, I had my plan in motion. She was slightly drunk, like she had been so often recently, and gave the same old excuse about work. It was hard to listen to her, but I kept my cool. I had one goal now, make sure she didn't just lose me, but her career, the kids, everything. The first thing I did was contact my lawyer. He confirmed my worst fears. To make sure the kids stayed with me after the divorce, I needed to gather solid evidence of her behavior. I had to be systematic about this. I wasn't just aiming to win the case. I wanted to destroy everything she had built. The next day, I took time off work. It was my first move. I met John again and told him I needed more evidence. Not just enough to prove the affair, but enough to devastate her in court. I also started looking into her work. She'd always had a stable job, but when I dug deeper, I found she'd already had a few issues with unprofessional conduct. This could be my leverage. The more I uncovered about her double life, the colder I became. I no longer felt pity or pain, just a desire to make her pay. I started planning my next move. I wanted to catch her red-handed with him. John kept gathering evidence, and I continued pretending that everything was normal. I even sat down with the kids and had an honest talk, though I spared them the brutal details. They had noticed how often their mother was gone, and I told them that she was dealing with a tough period at work. I couldn't let them know the truth, not yet. That would have to come from her. And when it did, I would be ready. Now there was only one question left: when to strike. After setting my plan in motion, it became clear that this wasn't just between Jennifer and me. Our kids, Sarah and Tim, deserved to know something, even if I couldn't tell them everything. Sarah was 12, sensitive, and always close to her mother. Tim, at 9, seemed unaware of most things happening around him, but I knew they both had noticed the changes. I knew I had to talk to them, but it was the hardest decision I'd made in recent weeks. I couldn't tell them the full story. I couldn't tell them their mother was cheating. That would destroy them. One evening, while Jennifer was out for another late-night meeting, I sat them down at the kitchen table. They had grown used to their mother's absence, but the weight of it was still heavy. I know you've noticed things have been a little different around here. I started, trying to keep my tone calm. Mom's been very busy with work lately, and it's kept her away more than we'd like. But I want you both to know it's not your fault. There's nothing to worry about. Sarah sat silently, her eyes slowly meeting mine. I could tell she understood. She didn't need any more words. She had been noticing the changes in her mother for a long time. Tim, on the other hand, just nodded. His face innocent and unbothered, still lost in his own world. But when will she be back? Tim asked, looking at his juice glass, completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. She'll be back, buddy, I said, forcing a smile. Just not as often as before. But I'll always be here, and we'll get through this together. I saw Sarah quietly wipe her eyes with her sleeve. She wasn't crying, but it was clear she was hurting. I knew how much she looked up to her mother, how close they had been. I wanted to protect her, to keep that ideal picture of our family intact for her. But I knew reality had already started to shatter her perception. Tim didn't notice those things like Sarah did. He asked again, "Are we still going to the hockey game with Mom next Sunday?" I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't even sure if Jennifer had any intention of spending time with them anymore. She had been neglecting all our family traditions. But I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let them feel abandoned. "If Mom can't make it, we'll go together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know you can always count on me." That conversation passed relatively quietly, but inside, I was in turmoil. I knew the truth would come out soon enough, and when it did, their world would flip upside down. I only hoped they would be ready. After that conversation with the kids, I knew there was no turning back. They had already started to understand that something was wrong, even though I hadn't told them the full truth. Sarah didn't ask me about her mom anymore, though I could see the worry in her eyes. She tried to keep her emotions hidden, but every time Jennifer came home late, I could tell it affected her. She was trying to stay strong, but it was tearing her apart. Another week went by, and during that time, John gathered even more evidence. He kept tailing Jennifer, tracking her movements, documenting her meetings with that man. By now, I knew his name, Tom. He was the typical charming type, with the kind of confidence that comes from years of manipulation. But what ate away at me most was that Jennifer had chosen him. John handed over more photos, and this time they were even worse. They were no longer hiding. I saw them together in that same bar, but now things looked far more intimate. They laughed, held each other, and I saw a look on her face that I hadn't seen in years. They weren't trying to conceal anything anymore. They kissed openly, like they no longer cared who saw them. I kept gathering the evidence, but my thoughts were focused on acting quickly. The next time she came home, I could smell not only alcohol on her, but also a cologne that wasn't mine. She once again dodged my questions about work, but this time I didn't back down. "What's going on, Jen?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, though inside, I was raging. She looked away, trying to come up with another lie, but this time her eyes gave her away. They were empty. She muttered something about a big project, but I was no longer listening. I realized then that whatever trust we once had was gone. I could never believe another word she said. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the kitchen, staring out the window. The plan was already forming in my head. I couldn't live in this lie anymore. Jennifer had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. I was going to expose everything, but I was going to do it on my terms. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. By now, I had more than enough evidence, and I knew I could win. But that wasn't the point. I needed to ensure she was left with nothing. Not just me and the kids, but her career, too. She deserved to lose it all. I began executing the plan in every detail. John provided me with more information about Tom, including where he worked and who his wife was. Yes, Tom had a family too, and I knew that piece of information would be my trump card. If Jennifer wanted to destroy our life, I would destroy hers. The next step was clear: catch them together. But this time I wouldn't stay silent. I would expose her in a way that left no room for her to recover. And when it happened, I would be ready. My plan was simple but effective. I couldn't let them continue living like nothing had happened. Knowing they no longer hid their meetings, I decided to use that against them. Jennifer and Tom started meeting at that same bar almost every Friday. I knew it had become their routine. They probably thought no one would notice. But this time, everything was different. I had a plan. I would catch them in the act. This time, I didn't just want evidence, I wanted witnesses. I prepared my camera, set up a few recording devices, and made sure to gather enough material to bury her in court. But most importantly, I wanted people to see them. I coordinated with John, and he arranged for a few people he knew to be at the bar at the right moment. It was Friday again, and Jennifer gave her usual excuse about having to work late. She dressed up nicer than usual, the same way she did every time she went to her meetings. This time, I didn't feel hurt or betrayed, just cold determination. I knew this would be the last night she thought she could keep up her lies. I followed her, keeping a safe distance. As always, she parked near the bar, and I watched as she walked in. A little while later, Tom arrived. They sat at their usual table, laughing and drinking. I saw him put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him as if it was the most natural thing in the world. John and his men were already inside. They were scattered around the bar, keeping an eye on things. I walked in, pretending to be just another customer. I sat at a different table but positioned myself so I could see them. Jennifer didn't notice me. They were too busy enjoying each other, too confident that no one was watching. I watched them, taking it all in, the drinks, the flirting, the way they looked at each other. They were laughing, drinking cocktails, and I saw Jennifer look at him with the same look she used to give me when we were happy. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I couldn't stand it any longer. My blood boiled, but I kept control. After a while, they finished their drinks, and Tom grabbed her hand, leading her toward the exit. I knew where they were going. I quickly left the bar and followed them as they drove to a nearby hotel. John and his men stayed back, but they were ready for what came next. When they entered the hotel, my heart was pounding, but it wasn't from pain anymore. It was pure resolve. I knew this was it. John had tapped into the hotel's surveillance system, and we watched them enter the room together. Everything was recorded. We had every move. "Michael, are you ready?" John asked, holding the camera. I took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, I was ready. With all the evidence I had, it was time to make my move. I walked up to the front desk and asked for a key to their room, saying I had forgotten my wallet inside. The clerk didn't hesitate and handed me the key. I approached the door, knowing that behind it, their final betrayal was unfolding. I didn't knock. I just opened the door and walked in. What I saw, I would never forget. They didn't even have time to react. The shock on their faces said more than words ever could. "Did you really think it would be this easy?" My voice was calm, but every word dripped with anger. Tom immediately pulled away, but it was too late. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos. Jennifer was sitting on the bed, still processing what was happening, her eyes slowly filling with fear. "This is over," I said. "You've lost everything." After walking into their hotel room and seeing everything with my own eyes, the pain that had been festering inside me for the past few months vanished in an instant. In its place, there was nothing but cold emptiness. I had known this was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for that moment. They both sat there, stunned and scared, like predators frozen in the headlights. Jennifer tried to say something, but I didn't let her. "Don't." I cut her off, my voice steady but laced with finality. "I know everything. Your lies don't matter anymore." Tom, the man she had thrown our life away for, stood up from the bed, trying to look calm, but his eyes betrayed the panic he felt. He was just as guilty as she was, and he knew it. I turned to him, my hands gripping my phone so tightly I thought it might break. "I'm not here to cause a scene," I said coldly, "but I want you to understand what happens next." Tom muttered something about it being a mistake, and it only happened once, but I just smiled. Once didn't matter to me. His fate was already sealed. He had handed me all the ammunition I needed. I had more than enough proof, and now I was going to destroy them both. I left the room without looking back, leaving them in the same position they had left me months ago, broken and helpless. My next step was clear: hand over everything to my lawyer and to John. The time had come to set my plan into motion. When I got home that night, Jennifer still wasn't back. I knew she wouldn't return for a while. She was likely panicking, trying to figure out her next move. But I wasn't worried anymore. I had all the control. I sat in the living room, staring into the dark, my mind focused on one thing: how to finish this story in a way that left her with nothing. The next morning, I met with my lawyer. He reviewed everything I handed him: photos, the hotel surveillance footage, the witness statements from John and his team. He nodded silently as he went through the evidence. "With this, we can win everything," he finally said. "You have grounds for divorce with full custody and minimal financial support." But I wanted more than just a divorce. I wanted to be sure Jennifer lost everything: her family, her career, her reputation. I already knew what my next move was. That afternoon, I called Tom's wife, Linda. I had gotten her number through John's investigation, and now I held the final piece of the puzzle in my hands. When she answered, her voice was tense, as if she already suspected something. "You should meet me," I said coldly. "You deserve to know what your husband's been doing behind your back." Her silence on the other end of the line told me she already knew something was wrong. I arranged to meet her at a cafe, and I prepared everything. When she saw what I had gathered, she would make sure Tom's life crumbled just like Jennifer's. My revenge was nearly complete, but the most important part was yet to come. That night, when Jennifer finally came home, she tried to speak to me. But I wasn't interested in her excuses anymore. She knew I knew. Her eyes were red from crying, but my heart no longer ached. I had been waiting for this moment, and now I was ready to see it through. "We need to talk," she started. I sat quietly, cold and detached. Now it was all up to me. She had lost everything, and she didn't even realize it yet. "It's too late for talking," I said. "Tomorrow it all ends." Her eyes filled with fear. She knew that tomorrow would mark the end of our life together, and for the first time, she realized that it was no longer in her hands. The next day was when everything was supposed to end. I met with Linda, Tom's wife, as planned. She looked exhausted, as if she had already sensed something was wrong long before we met. I knew she was about to learn the truth, but how it was delivered would rest on my shoulders, or, rather, on my lack of guilt. We sat in a quiet corner of the cafe, and I wasted no time. I showed her the photos, their embraces, kisses, dinners, the hotel. Her hands trembled as she took one of the pictures. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. I decided to give her a moment. I sat silently, watching as realization slowly spread across her face that her life was now as shattered as mine had been. "Why are you showing me this?" Linda finally asked, her voice hollow, as if speaking through a fog of pain. Because you deserve to know, I replied. We both do. She nodded, and I saw anger begin to replace the initial shock. I could only imagine what it felt like to learn that the person you trusted had destroyed your life. Linda stood up from the table without a word and walked out of the cafe. I knew Tom would soon be facing the consequences of his actions, just like Jennifer. Now, I had to finish things with my wife. When I returned home, I knew there were only a few key steps left. Jennifer could no longer avoid what was coming. She already understood that I wasn't going to settle for just a simple divorce. It was obvious to her by now. I gathered all the materials I needed, everything that would hit her the hardest. My lawyer confirmed that I could take full custody of the kids and leave her with minimal financial support, if any. She had lost everything, and it was only a matter of time before she realized the full extent of her losses. That evening, when Jennifer came home, we sat at the table. She looked exhausted and defeated even before we began to speak. Michael, she started, her voice trembling. I know I made a mistake. I know you won't forgive me. But you're right, I interrupted coldly. I won't forgive you. I stared at her, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Now, she understood that there was no going back. I placed the divorce papers in front of her. You're going to sign these now. Otherwise, I'll throw you out of this house with nothing, and you'll never see the kids again. She gasped, gripping the table as if it were her lifeline. Her eyes widened with panic, and I could see her struggling with the reality of what was happening. Michael, please, her voice broke. I'm still your wife. We can fix this. Find a way. Find a way. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You already found your way, Jennifer. You chose Tom. Now it's just a matter of time before you leave his life the same way you left ours. Tears streamed down her face, but they didn't move me. I remained as cold as stone. The kids will stay with me, I continued. I've already arranged everything with my lawyer. You'll accept the terms I'm offering, or you'll lose even the little you have left. You can't take the kids from me, Michael, she sobbed, but her words were empty. She knew she had already lost. I already have, I said, signing the last page of the documents. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the papers that had destroyed her life just as she had destroyed mine. Everything was now in my control. The days after everything ended felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Jennifer signed the divorce papers almost immediately after our last conversation. She had no choice. I had taken away any hope she had of holding on to what we had built together. We no longer spoke. She understood that words didn't matter anymore. Her world was crumbling, and I wasn't going to help her pick up the pieces. The kids, thankfully, still didn't know the full truth. I tried to keep them as far away from the conflict as possible. Sarah didn't ask about her mom anymore, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She spent more time at home with me and Tim, quietly observing everything without speaking. I knew it was tearing her up inside, but she was trying to be strong. Tim, as always, lived in his own world. To him, everything was simple. Mom wasn't coming home as often, and Dad was taking care of things. He didn't grasp the depth of what was happening, and I was grateful for that. The last thing I wanted was to break their hearts the way mine had been broken. Jennifer was gone from our lives, though she still tried to hold on to the remnants. She called a few times, sent me messages begging for a chance to see the kids. Her attempts felt desperate, but I kept my distance. I didn't respond to the calls. I ignored her pleas. She had chosen this path, and I had no intention of letting her back in. One day, I received a message from Linda, Tom's wife. She confirmed that she had filed for divorce. Tom had tried to explain things to her, but like me, she had no intention of forgiving him. We both knew our lives had been irreversibly changed, and now it was just a matter of time before both Tom and Jennifer faced the consequences of their actions. I could see that my plans were coming to fruition. Jennifer had lost her job. Her relationship with Tom had become public in her workplace, and once I shared the information with her employer, they decided to terminate her contract. Now she was unemployed, without a husband, without a career, and without any real chance of rebuilding her life. She had lost more than I ever imagined she could. But there was one thing I still hadn't fully resolved. The kids. Despite everything she had done, I could see that they missed her. Sarah never said it out loud, but her eyes gave it away. She knew her mom wasn't coming back, but her heart hadn't accepted it yet. One evening, I decided to have a talk with Sarah. We sat at the kitchen table, and I knew it was time to give her some kind of explanation, as much as a 12-year-old could understand. Sarah, I started, my voice calm. I know you're worried about Mom. She made a mistake. A big mistake, and right now, I'm doing everything I can to protect you and Tim. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes were on the verge of tears, but she was trying to stay strong. Why isn't she with us anymore? She finally asked, her voice weak but filled with pain. I couldn't tell her the whole truth. I couldn't explain the affair, or that her mother had thrown us away for another man. Mom and I can't be together anymore, I said, looking directly into her eyes. It's hard, but you need to know that I'll always be here for you. Mom wants to be in your lives, but things have become more complicated than any of us imagined. Sarah nodded, but I could see her heart breaking. She didn't say another word. She just quietly got up and walked to her room. I knew she was trying to process everything on her own. Tim, meanwhile, stayed immersed in his games, oblivious to the storm raging around us. He was too young to understand the tragedy unfolding in our family. That night, as I sat alone, I realized my revenge was complete. Jennifer had lost everything, but so had I. Pieces of my family, parts of my soul. I had won this battle, but the emptiness it left behind was overwhelming.